Super quick introductions. So the topic of this session is, of course, experimentation or ethnography. And to debate this, we have here Erin McLaine, Director of Product at Freeletics and also the former head of experimentation at Delivery Hero. And Rina Jensen, Director of UX Research, UX Research and Design at the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative and the former Director of Design and Product at Mozilla Open Innovation. Those are a lot of words in a title. Cool. So yeah, by the titles, you can probably already tell who's kind of leaning which way. So without further ado, I would hand it over to Erin to kick us off with her 7-minute pitch.
Sure, thank you. Thanks for the intro, and thanks everybody for joining. It's great to be here. As Philip said, I'm working as the Director of Product at Freeletics since 7 months now, which I'm thoroughly enjoying. I have worked in product for 15 years. 7 of those were in New York. The last 8 years I've been living in Berlin with my German husband, and I have 2.5-year-old boy-girl twins, which is an experiment of its own. I wanted to take my time here today to talk a little bit about my experience working at Delivery Hero, which is one of the global leaders in food delivery. So, creating the connection between restaurants and customers so that you can order online, and my path to experimentation that I had there. So I started working at Delivery Hero as a product manager, and after a short time, my CEO suggested that we hire somebody to focus on A/B testing. And this was super beneficial for me because I've worked at other companies along the way where we always said we wanted to do A/B testing or experimentation, but we never had the resources, never had the time. And what happened was we actually hired my husband, and because he was studying development. And so he was studying development in a front-end aspect, and we gave him access to A/B testing, but not the full product and not the code. So as the product manager, when I was working with the rest of the developers and working with the teams on prioritizing what we were going to do in the sprint, I couldn't say, okay, let's just take my husband and add him to the resources so that we can get things done quicker, because he didn't have access to the code. So it really put us in a place where we had to think of work for him to do in the A/B testing area. And I think that was one of the coolest things about it that really forced us to get up and running. In terms of my slides, I'll just start going through. So when I talk about experimentation or in product in general, I think there's 3 product pitfalls that we have to avoid. Number 1 is not getting learnings. And this goes, I think, more into traditional back in the day styles of product development, where we didn't get any learnings because we would build products according to the highest paid person's opinion. And so I think it's important to hear this person's opinion and to get ideas from them and be able to take your stance and give feedback. But just taking what they do and implementing it is, I think we all know, not the best way to run our product businesses. The second one here is trusting users too much. And so my argument, while I think that ethnography is super valuable and that it is a necessary part of the product life cycle, I also don't think we can put all of our eggs into that basket, because the way that users behave during user tests or research won't always replicate their actual behavior. And the 2 examples that I used regarding this most often were about, and according to the data or the polls rather, Brexit wasn't supposed to happen. And also 4 years ago, Trump wasn't supposed to become the president of the United States. But everything that the polls told us turned out that people behaved a different way once it actually got down to the final test. And the third thing here is not doing your homework. So I think that although while I value experimentation and I think it's super important, it isn't an excuse to skip processes like user testing and market research and be lazy. So I think it's a great way, in a complicated meeting, if you have a ton of people there, to be able to say, okay, we have several different opinions here. We're going to pause this conversation and take some of the opinions and go test them and come back with some results. I think that's really valuable, but at the same time, it shouldn't be an answer for everything. And it shouldn't cause us to forget who we are, especially working on the product side. We have a lot of knowledge that we can access and gather to make educated decisions, so that not every single little tiny thing on the web or on your product has to be a test in all cases. And then, oh, sorry, I lost my screen share. Sorry about that. Here we are. Yeah, so those are the main things that I want to watch out for. And when I talk about getting started with experimentation, I also have 4 main tips I wanted to talk about. So the first is checking your data and making sure that your data is working. When we started this process at Delivery Hero, we had to work, Delivery Hero is a company that's made up of acquisitions. So we had a bunch of different teams around the world working on different products. I think that says 2 minutes left. And so we really had to improve our data process in order to make sure that we could conduct valid experiments. Number 2 is know your funnel. So this helps determine the best opportunities. When we started out, we ran tests mostly on the homepage, but as we got to know our funnel and see where the users had the most pain points, we were able to run more valuable experiments because we saw that the homepage wasn't the main pain point for our users. Number 3, don't try to be perfect. And this is a way to say, learn from your mistakes. So I think that rather than taking 6 months to set up an experimentation team and run with it, just get somebody, which is number 4, dedicate a resource, get somebody going, try some things out and learn from where you're going. And that's it. I just wanted to mention a quote by Jeff Bezos, which says that our success at Amazon is a function of how many experiments we do per year, per month, per week, and per day. Thank you very much.
All right. I didn't need my 2 minutes sticky after all.
I felt pressured with the two minutes.
Sorry about that. Sorry.
No, it's good.
Actually, that means we have 20 seconds for a chat question, but I think actually, oh yeah, for knowing the funnel in a complex ecosystem, would you recommend some visual method like customer journeys?
I do. We worked a little bit with customer journeys at our previous, I worked at Home to Go for a few months last year, and that was also really valuable. We didn't have something like that at Delivery Hero. It was basically looking at each step and where were the users falling off and where were the biggest gaps we used that to educate our decisions.
Cool. All right. Then thank you so much, Erin. We'll come back to much more discussion later. But for the next 7 minutes, I will hand it over to Rina.
Thank you, Philip. Yeah, so I'm Rina Jensen. I'm the Director of Design and UX Research at the Science Initiative at the Chan Zuckerberg Institute. It is a mouthful, isn't it? I'm originally from Denmark, but I currently live in San Francisco, where I live with my British husband and our now very American 1-year-old son. I've been working at a research in some form or way for the last 13 years, and I made my way into design and design management about 5 years ago. I've really, for a long time, had a passion for mixed method research, so I'm super excited about discussing experimentation versus ethnography today with Erin. I think that the challenge we face is really where the intersection and collaboration between those methods lie and how we build that into our product development. So it'll be exciting to discuss some good tips for that. I wanted to start off today, however, to give a bit of background on ethnography and product development and how I see the value of it. And by doing that, I will start with some context, because we will talk a little bit about context as part of ethnography. So as a young computer science student back in Denmark, I think a long time ago, I had my first class in human-computer interaction, and I was immediately kind of perplexed by this idea of like, how do we actually design systems for human interaction? And when I first started out in this field, it was focused a lot on like how we design for today. So we were very focused on kind of skeuomorphism, like how do we represent the real world in our UIs? And we did some horrible experimentations back then, which if you ever want to Google the 90s skeuomorphism, GUI, do it, it's fun. Today we know better and we understand affordances in software design a lot better. And that's part of how we create these more beautiful and seamless user experiences for users online. And I'm going to argue that part of how we got there was ethnography. The ethnography, as I understand it, or as I define it, is the systematic study of individual behavior and cultural context over time. I will hop a little bit on this over time point. And I don't think we would have been able to in the past get to where we are today, where we can design complex systems and make them seamless user experiences in some instances not, but we have the tools to do it for most of it. But I don't think our challenges are over. There's increasing investments in AI, big data, like a million tons of different types of realities. And as researchers, designers, PMs, engineers, we are now faced with trying to understand how does human behavior contextualize into affordances and these new methods of interaction. So when we think about how ethnography can help here, it's in the essence a systematic way to understand behavior and culture. And what that does is it allows us to understand how users' behavior change over time, and it also allows us to understand how users make decisions over time. So I pulled a quote from Intel. This is by a talk given at Epic. I can give a little pitch for epicpeople.org while I'm in it, which is a great organization if you're interested in ethnography and product development. Ken Anderson and team spoke about how they've used ethnography to help also set strategy for Intel. And he talked about it like this, so I'm gonna read because this is a quote. So Intel can analyze the latest buying patterns and customer surveys for useful data, but people often can't articulate what they're looking for in products and services. So by understanding how people live, their cultural context, researchers can discover otherwise elusive trends that can inform company future strategy. Another example that's from my own background is a former project I worked at while at Mozilla, where we wanted to understand more about how people make product choices with ethical consideration. About 4 or 5 years ago, we had, like everyone else at that time, discovered that people were starting to make buying decisions based on ethical factors. We saw that in things like Toms and glasses and like other things that were happening in the market. And we were wondering, can this or will this actually influence how they make online choices of products at some point in the future or maybe already today? And the way we decided to go and figure this out was to understand their cultural context, because we didn't have enough to say, oh, we have a theory or we have an understanding here. And so we spent time in field with users from all over the world that had shown kind of an ethical consideration in their behavior in some other parts of their lives to try and understand how could and would this maybe influence future choices. We developed a theory, and we then subsequently tested that theory in more quantifiable ways using surveys and other research methods to try and define what these segments actually meant. The work led to us to identify something that we called the conscious chooser segment, which was a segment that was hugely important for Mozilla's rebranding, for our positioning, and also some of the new product development that they later did. So ethnography is just not like elusive or an easy fix or some sort of mysterious potion we put on it. It is systematic and longitudinal. So over time, understanding of how the users you are targeting and their cultural context changes. This will influence their decision-making. So it will influence how they engage with your product. And as such, for successful companies, it has to be part of how we set strategy and how we set product strategy. And at its heart, it's super different from how we view experimentation. So in ethnography, we don't start from a hypothesis and we don't come up with an experiment to prove that hypothesis. Instead, we start with an open mind so that we can accumulate more information, we can understand context, and we can gather that into theories. Now, these theories, once they're defined, can be tested in a more systematic way or in a more scientific approach, but your opening stance has to be one of empathy and understanding of your user's cultural context. And as such, real ethnographic exploration is hard and time-consuming because you're aiming to build a system to understand your users, and that always changes because culture always changes. But it is also an invaluable tool in understanding areas for innovation and strategic direction that is going to face you and your product moving forward. And it does give you a deep understanding of your user's context. To develop good products, however, we can't be in this kind of cultural exploration mode all the time. Sometimes we have to look up, both as researchers and as PM and as leaders in business, and see what's happening today, what's going on today. And so the challenge is really, for me, how do we create this space for like long-term ethnographic research, but also have ongoing research and things like A/B testing that can help drive product development. So I'm super excited to discuss that more with Erin today.
Well, thank you so much, Rina. All right. So yeah, we have 15 minutes now to just chat a little bit about all of that, and maybe to like throw the first little stone into that pond. I noticed something interesting between both of your talks. So Erin, you mentioned that when your husband joins Delivery Hero, and basically him being there created the space for this role, or created this role of someone working on A/B tests. And at the same time, Rina, you talked a lot about ethnography being really instrumental in informing the strategy, starting without the hypothesis and so forth. So what that makes me wonder a little bit, like, if once you have an ethnographer at your company, does that then mean that you basically have to, you're kind of constantly reevaluating strategy? And I mean, if so, would that be a good thing?
I can go first, but I think the first thing I'll say is it's rare for not major companies to have full-time ethnographers just dedicated to strategy exploration. I think is a thing that I'm constantly thinking about as I build up teams as well. But my instinct is that it's actually better to have people who are in the problems day to day have some time taken off to be able to do this. So the way that I generally try to set like our schedules and our roadmaps is to say our researchers need to have about 20 to 25% of their time to be able to go and do something that's like on a longer scale perspective, because that way they understand the product really well. And I think if you have this like floating ethnographer, there's going to be a lot of time in understanding every single product again and again and again, and like it will take time to get in. Whereas if you can kind of figure out a way to get it baked into your work stream, it's better. But it's super hard, because the problem is every time we are thinking, oh, this would be an interesting thing to go look at, we have like something here that we see changing in user behavior that we don't fully understand. We have to somehow take that time out, right? And like argue for that time within our work. And that's like a constant pull and push on how we do that. So there's no easy way. But to the latter one, I think companies should always be questioning their strategies, because they will and should be living things, right? If they aren't, we die, and we don't follow what has happening in the environment.
Yeah, and I'm definitely aligned with that. I think I was actually just talking to my team about how, 14 years ago, we would be required to build one-year roadmaps, and there were always the same items that were on the bottom of the roadmap. But yet every year we still had to build a one-year roadmap, and there were just items that we knew we would never get to because we live in such a dynamic place. And we've also just gone through the process at Freeletics of going through a product strategy that's a 2 to 3 year guideline. However, what we need to be really clear about as we're moving towards that is saying this can and likely will change. I hope it doesn't change a lot, but we need to recognize that we can't joke and try to pretend that it's really going to be stable the whole 2 or 3 years, because we just live in a dynamic world, and tech is such a dynamic place, and we need to be able to also be iterative and reactive and see where we're adding value, and see opportunities and add more value there when we have chances. In terms of the structure with ethnographers, I've had different sorts of structures. So actually at Delivery Hero, when we jumped into A/B testing, we didn't have any clear user researches or anything. We just had our designers who would basically focus on the wireframe side and mock-ups, and I actually went with the head of marketing, and I traveled to Manchester, England, because that's where our product was in the UK. So we went to Manchester and talked to restaurant owners and customers about their experiences and tried to understand their behaviors, and recognized how the behaviors of the consumers in the UK were very different than the consumers in Germany and very different than the consumers in Kuwait, and how those cultural differences really impact their buying patterns and things like that. So we didn't have somebody dedicated to do that. I have had that much more over the past, but it's been rare. Like, I have had it more over the past about 2 years of my career, really. And I definitely see the value there. But there's also a challenge that we often see in terms of how long do you spend gathering information and observing versus moving and doing and gathering data and numbers.
Yeah, that is a challenge. The way we structure it, or the way I've historically structured it, and I think this is how it worked at Mozilla as well, is our UX researchers would carry out the ethnographic work as well, when and if there was time for it. And that's the time bit is the crucial part, right? And I think that's part of one of the things that I'm always aware of as a manager, is that it's part of my role to carve out that time and insist that we have that time in the roadmaps, because otherwise even our user research can quickly become reactive, right? And we don't want to always be focused on that. But it's such a balancing act between making sure we are doing things that create immediate value for the product teams and help them move forward on product decisions, while at the same time also taking space to ask those longer questions. A way that I've found it work really well is actually when PMs like Erin are in this like strategy setting phase, working with them to identify what are the key hypotheses or assumptions that we're making in here that we don't necessarily fully or like understand enough about, or that we haven't fully, but we're taking a bet. Because if we can design kind of over, if it's a 2 to 3 year strategy, if we can design some of these like deep dives over the next 1 to 2 years, and we can kind of plan for them longer, it's easier to get it into the process and work with them. But it's like the three-legged stool we always talk about. It requires really close collaboration between, UX, both research and design, engineering, and PMs to make that work.
Yeah.
Actually, somewhat related to that and to the role of ethnographic studies, I think Florian had a really cool question in the chat. Would you argue that theories based on ethnographic studies are better for spotting blue oceans and disruptive innovations, and that experimentation is finding a local optimum for an existing product space or business model? Is that something that resonates with you?
Do you want me to go first? Do you want to go first, Erin?
Sure, go for it.
Okay. I mean, I think for me, I would probably argue that. I think at least over time, it's better at spotting that. I think what A/B testing can do sometimes is that it can, like, if you discover something that you didn't expect, it can highlight an area where you need to go and understand it further. But you will always need that qualitative, contextual understanding in order to really understand what's going on the user behavior. Just making decisions based on data that you don't understand, I don't think that's probably not going to alone help you discover blue ocean opportunities.
Yeah, and I would pretty much agree. I think, with experimentation, we can take risks, and we can try things that are completely different from what we've been doing, but we're also working in a space where we're working with our existing user base or new users who are coming in through the product that we've been trying to market. So we have to understand that they're still expecting the same kind of product or what we're trying to sell them. And so if we're trying to do something completely innovative and different, then they might not necessarily be receptive to that. And we have to see how well that fits with what we've currently been doing on an existing product space.
Yeah, one note that I found found interesting in your talks was when Rina mentioned that actually ethnography isn't really the thing that should start with a hypothesis, which of course is the complete opposite from what we talk about in experimentation, and frankly, at least in my experience, in most of product work. So I mean, that makes me wonder two things. First of all, I know, Erin, if you have an opinion on that, and then also, is there a type of experimentation that maybe also comes from more can act more on these theory type spaces rather than hypothesis spaces?
I think in terms of not having a hypothesis, to me, that's okay. However, I would say, does it have a goal? What are the goals, or is it just a complete blank slate of observation versus are you trying to learn something in particular while you have no idea what the hypothesis of the answer might be? You have a particular thing that you're trying to learn and study, and so you kind of know what direction you can head based on the outcome of that goal.
Yeah, I think that's totally right. If we were gonna go back to 1922 and old school anthropologists doing ethnography, they would say you go into the culture to learn, right? And you're there to immerse these theories of change. But I think when we do product work, we normally have a goal. Even in the Mozilla example that I gave, we had a goal. We had not a hypothesis, but a question that we were wondering about, right? And so I, at least, have never had so much white space that I was allowed to just say, I'm just going to go explore and have fun. But having said that, I know that there are companies that do that, right? And if anyone is in the ethnographic field, they will know Jan Chipchase, right, who worked for Nokia for many years when I was there as well. And a lot of his work was completely open field, and he would just go around and observe users' behavior and report back on changes.
Nice. And then in terms of experimentation, I would say, not having a hypothesis is not so common, but perhaps it goes into, actually also kind of goes back into the innovation space. The question is about doing things like smoke testing. So where you perhaps don't know much about a particular topic and what impact it's going to have. And so you throw something out there basically and see if it sticks. So for example, at the first tech company that I worked for was part of IAC in New York, and we built toolbars that would be attached to browsers. And the way they would decide which product to build next was by creating marketing material and putting advertisements out there to say, okay, sign up for the daily Bible verse. And based on how that marketing campaign would go, and so depending on clicks, they would see interest and say, this feature is coming soon. Thanks for your interest, and just blatantly say it's not here. And then we could measure that, the impact of that versus other products that we experimented on, and say, oh, this got even more clicks than this really successful product that we had, and therefore we should really build this one out. And that would determine what products we would build, which was a really interesting way to build things. It didn't have a lot of hypothesis behind it. It was purely experimental.
So it was the proverbial spaghetti against the wall.
Yep.
Nice. Actually, related to that, Cyril just asked in the chat, talking from your experience, how did you get to your experiment with the biggest impact? So what was the process between the most impactful experiments that you've ever done? And I think actually this is a question to both of you.
Yeah, one of the most memorable ones I had at Delivery Hero was where we tested the first landing page for the product was where you enter your address. So if you're getting food delivery, you enter your address or your zip code, your location, and then you go on to the restaurant list. And so we took that homepage, with that postal code entry, and we changed the background into a video. And that video showed like chicken skewers and somebody moving their hand and turning the chicken in some sauce. And the funny thing was, we had been at a conference about experimentation and A/B testing, and somebody up on stage said, you know what, just because at the time, I think PayPal had a little bit of an animation in the background, Airbnb did as well. And they weren't huge videos, but there were some movement, some dynamic things going on. And the person on stage said, you know, just because Airbnb is doing it and PayPal's doing it doesn't mean you should do it, you know, because they're different and it works for them, but it actually, videos are really bad and they slow things down and you probably shouldn't do it. And then shortly after that, our marketing department came to us and said, we want to test a video on the homepage. And we said, okay, well, we're willing to test it. I mean, we won't launch it without testing it. So let's see what happens. And we tested it and it had a huge impact. So it was super surprising based on some of the things we'd heard. It was also a really interesting test because it increased our overall conversions and so our overall orders by a ton, but it decreased the number of people going to the restaurant list itself. So the hypothesis there, or the theory that we come up with without actually talking to the users, is that the video pre-qualified people who were really interested or not. And so the people who were really, or else, you know, the people who were on the fence perhaps got hungrier by seeing the food moving, but the people who weren't interested and, you know, they just dropped out quicker, and the people who continued were much more invested and continued through the process in a much more likely manner.
Pretty cool. It's a nice way to also talk about how you have to like begin to understand your findings, right? You can't just look at the numbers.
Yeah, true. True.
I think mine is probably work we did with the open source community at Mozilla, which was really interesting for me, which was one of the spaces where I had a little bit more space to do some white space work. There was questions from the community team at that point around what motivates our open source contributors at Mozilla to try and get involved, and like what barriers are they facing. And I got to, for 3 months, just meet with open source contributors and talk about their journeys and how they got involved and what was hard and what wasn't working for them and what they loved about contributing to the project. And we talked to them about several different projects, and it allows us to build a model for motivations around open source, which I still use and still talk about at conferences, and I'm really proud of that work. And the brilliant thing about working from Mozilla is that it was open sourced, so it was publicly available everywhere. It also led to some more interest from leadership, which I thought was really interesting, because they started to kind of, I think, put people behind like, oh yeah, we're an open source project, but they were so removed from a lot of it, except for maybe our CEO now, but at that time he wasn't our CEO. We later, with the support of my then manager, did both like a lot of mixed method research. We did testing on several of our open source like front pages to try and see if we could improve the user experiences of onboarding, which we successfully did. We built our own project within the community and successfully launched that, and is successful today. And I think we one of the things that I'm most proud of, which was for sure a huge teamwork from the entire team, and we were definitely more than probably 20 people working on different parts of this, but was getting an actual understanding of how much contribution is done to the projects at the company to try and put a value on it. And I think that's like holistic understanding of, you know, what does it actually mean and how much is actually at stake here, which was quite a lot. Led the leadership to understand that actually we have to invest in this. This isn't something we can just leave. And we created the open innovation team at that point, which is the one where I was the head of design and later product for, and tried to do several different things to kind of improve open source contribution within the company. Some that were great, some that were not super great, and we for sure failed at, but it was really interesting work.
Cool. All right, yeah, we have reached the everyone part of this session. So I'm just gonna start adding people to the stage. I see Malte Krebs has been waiting here for a while. And then also Kieran is joining. So if you haven't yet and you want to join the stage, click the blue button on the top right of your screen and you'll be right up here. All right, Kieran, you made it first.
Thanks. Hey, Jensen and Erin. My question is about right now, many companies are in general, all the internet blogs are sort of bragging about how every company should be A/B testing any feature they launch. But in the product I'm working, I constantly face this challenge of potentially there are some behavior changing ones, features we are trying to launch, which has an initial resistance and probably doesn't show a big A/B test impact. But there are some quick wins or iterations on your existing product, which have that huge percentages or the changing in numbers. So, but then how can you still use data? Because like, your A/B test is saying you should invest in this feature or that, but you know that this is much more strategic, the behavior changing ones. How can you still use data or to convince people that this is a better one to invest in?
I don't know if I clearly got the question, but my reaction would be that it isn't necessarily about using data in this case, but having a more clear product strategy, perhaps. And you know, therefore having the opportunity to go towards the strategic things and the strategic direction, and not just, you know, going up at every quick win that comes up and getting lost in that cycle.
Okay.
Does that make sense? Or Rina, do you want to add anything?
I think that's definitely your area of expertise. So I think that sounds right.
Cool then.
Cool. Do we have anyone else who wants to join us up here on stage? Only if you click the blue button can I add you here. Meanwhile, let's see what we have from the chat. Oh, Laura. All right. Just a second. And then there's Sebastian joining as well.
Hey, hello.
Hello.
Hey, hello. So greetings from Malmo. I am sitting in Malmo, Sweden. So I think I typed the question in the chat, but obviously it's much better to do this like in person digitally. So yeah, I have a question for Rina. Since I work for Arduino, I can relate to also working in an open source company. And I wanted to know what were like the challenges or like some experiences in your role in there, and especially when it comes to, you know, UX and product development.
It's a good question. So I've continued in my open source explorations, and partly why I've joined CCI and the Science Initiative is that we're focused on building open source software for scientists. So we're still like in that space and mindset. Honestly, the kind of road mapping, like what's next strategy thing is the thing I find the hardest, because in a normal product team, there's like, you know, pretty defined roles and responsibilities, and we go and we do research and we look and we, you know, converge, and then we diverge, and then we converge into like, what are we gonna build and agree on? And I find in open source work, we can't do that in a vacuum, right? We have to constantly check back in with the community, and the community has input, and they need to have that input as well. And sometimes they are much smarter about these things than we are, especially for the company I'm working for now, where, you know, the community is scientists, and they, you know, both build, hack, and use the products. And so they are, you know, really the experts there. So designing those checkpoints where we make sure we go out and check in and we constantly are there is like a hard muscle to build, and it takes time. And unless you've got like a PM or engineer or UX person, all three ideally, who are really passionate about it, it can be a real challenge to ensure that that happens. And so I think part of why I was proud of the work we did at Mozilla was that it helped show the value to the teams. You know, we could literally go to them and say, this is how much of your code is coming from your community. If you leave this alone, this is how much of what goes into the world that you will lose out on, right? And so trying to have that conversation with leadership to try and also push that agenda down. But it both makes product development slower and faster. And by that, I mean that the kind of going back and forth takes more time. But when you see, you know, a feature that you've had on your roadmap for like, you know, as Erin was saying, forever, because you haven't been able to prioritize it, and someone from the community comes in and like sends a pull request to you and it's there, and you're like, oh my God, like I just saved like 3 months of development time, right? So you've got to kind of weigh up the time it takes to like do that work with the fact that you are exponentially improving the development time. And so I think the end like summit is that it is faster, but it feels slower for the product teams that are in it.
Thank you. I can totally relate to that as well, because these information loops and the feedback loops take some time.
Yeah.
Getting your hands to that information can take some time.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Cool. Before we get to Sebastian, super quick administrative note. So we officially now have entered the break. The next session with Daniel and Indy will start in 10 minutes. We will just continue to go on here for another 20 minutes, but now you know. All right, Sebastian, all yours.
First of all, thanks a lot for the discussion. It's been super interesting so far. My question relates a bit more to the process involved and how you transport findings, like basically all the way down from, I think, Rina, you said it, sometimes you have this wide, big space where you can basically venture here and there, and then eventually maybe you find something that would be worth tackling, and then you might want to start a very concrete experiment with a hypothesis and get it implemented at last. And the question would be, how do you make sure that basically from the very beginning down to the development teams, you transport those findings so that people that are involved implementing really understand where this is coming from? Because I mean, you quite often have this break right on the product, where the product owner or the product manager still understands why we are kind of doing this, like down to from the first initial thought to the concrete implementation, but the team is kind of lost there and might not be able to contribute to that.
Yeah, do you want me to go, Erin, or?
Yeah, you can start.
I haven't found an easy way to do this, unfortunately, but I think the key is like participation. So the product manager should always, you know, as a UXR person, we should always have the product manager at our side, and they should be fully invested in everything we're doing, even if it's longitudinal and they, you know, don't necessarily need the answers right now. They should be supporting and behind what we're doing. And so building that stakeholder relationship is like a key part of our work as researchers. And the only other way that I have found that this truly works is by workshopping through it. And I'm currently going through the struggles of COVID because I'm still trying to figure out how to do this remotely effectively. But I think, you know, having time where you take the team out of their day-to-day work and say, here are our findings, listen to some people talk, like listen to snippets of actual interviews, let's discuss what this means and co-create those insights. Then let's discuss what those insights mean and what our recommendations would be, prioritize those recommendations and make them into hypotheses, is the only way that I found that engineers, like all the way down to implementation, take ownership of those things as well. And I also like to really push the researchers that I work with, and I spend a lot of time doing this myself when I was a researcher, an individual contributor as well, to follow your research through. So if you do research, what are the actual Jira tickets or, you know, whatever system you use that come out of it, and how can we follow them through to final? We use GitHub a lot because obviously it's open source, but like how can we follow the actual implementation through and take ownership of them? And it's hard work, and it's also a space where researchers sometimes aren't that comfortable, right? Like sitting in development meetings and discussing like how would we implement this, but I think it's a super valuable thing to do.
Yeah, and I would second that. You know, really making sure there's the alignment and that everybody is understanding the goals. Like I said, even if there's not hypotheses, but if there's a goal and everybody's aligned with that goals, then that's the best way to get to success. You know, speaking from the product standpoint, it's always super hard to prioritize things. And there's always a million things you would like to be working on. And so it's hard when somebody comes to you and says, here's 5 more things that would be great if you do them. And, you know, some things maybe will be high on the list, but unfortunately, there's always going to be things that are more towards the bottom of the list. So if you're not aligned in the beginning and everybody's agreed on the goals that you're going towards, then it's going to be really hard to get things in.
What I found really interesting, what you just said, Rina, about you have to follow through, right? So because that's what I hear from people working UX quite a lot. That so basically we dump this on the development team, and then at some point it kind of reappears, and maybe we have an alignment, and then sometimes it's like we envisioned it, and sometimes it isn't, right? And maybe to add to that is how do you make sure that the stuff that is not really working once this is live gets then removed from the product again? Because I think that is then the next step, right? I mean, maybe even if you have done like a B test, or if you have done an experiment at some point, the question is, when do you decide to throw out like all the work you put into the research and you got it down to the team and then you implemented it, and then there's this point where you think, oh, it's not working. Are we improving it or are we throwing it out? So how do you decide that? And maybe that is more a question to Erin then.
I mean, to me, that's just about, iterations. And it could be that, so even if we run an experiment on a particular area or feature, for example, the homepage test I talked about and putting a video there, you know, does that mean that should live there forever? Not necessarily, because maybe we find in a year that this isn't making people hungry anymore and people are annoyed by it, and the technology and internet industry, the look and feel of it has gone a different direction by then. And so, you know, especially when I'm talking about that video, I think I'm referring to 2015 or 2016. So things have changed a lot since then. And so we always were clear about that and said, you know, we should be retesting that. And we should be testing again, maybe against the old control or against a new control that's more up to date and fits better with today's world. So I think that's totally fair. But again, that also has to be prioritized against other things. So in order to really retest that in the future, we need to recognize that we have an opportunity on that page, or we're losing traffic that maybe, you know, maybe our numbers have gone down. And so we realize that something is changing, something needs to be fixed again, or else we could be working on different areas of the product and not really looking there as long as it's seeming stable.
I'm not going to dive into the prioritization topic now. I guess that's like a whole different talk. Thanks so much, you two.
Thank you, Sebastian.
Yeah, you're welcome. Philip, I think you're muted.
Good indeed. Thank you very much. Cool. Yeah, so we're just joined by Muhammad.
Yeah, hi, hello, greetings from Singapore. How
Hi.
are you guys doing? Yeah,
Good.
it's nighttime here. Yeah, so I'm like, something's been bugging me that, let's say you join the project like at the later stage, so you're just the UX advisor, right? Then you join the project at the later stage, and you get to know that they didn't really focus much on the UX and the research are not in place. So is it too late for you to step in and to start everything back, like the research, the prioritization and everything? Yeah, so like I'm kind of overwhelmed here, you know. Yeah.
I'm sorry to hear that you're overwhelmed and frustrated. You know, I think it really depends. For me, that would be very much dependent on the company. You know, some companies might be flexible. It really depends on what goals they're trying to achieve, and if they think that what they have are going to achieve those goals. You know, if they have business metrics that I've also worked in the beginning. We had release dates that were correlated to advertisement in Times Square, or TV commercials, or the physical dolls that were going on shelves in toy stores. So, you know, we didn't have the time to go back and revisit things once we were moving, as long as we felt that we were going towards our goals. So it really depends on what you're trying to achieve and how flexible the business is. But I do think that what I would say is that, as much as possible, to be able to argue for your point of view in a very visual way, also in a metrics way, you know, to show where they're going, what they're trying to achieve, and how you think that could be different, and what you think they could gain by doing that differently, and making that super clear to them, so that would provide more of a chance or opportunity for change.
Yeah, I mean, it's always a conflict between the stakeholders and you yourself, right? Like you say, you need to prioritize and maximize product outcomes. Yeah, so I think I find it's always a little too late when you try to step in and change the stakeholders' mindset.
It's hard when you come in, and I think I would rarely recommend.
Sorry, just super quick before you start. Indy Young's and Daniel Booker's session is starting now for those of you who want to jump over there, but we will still keep going here for another 10 minutes. Sorry for the interruption.
Okay, I'll be fast. I was just going to say that I really agree with Erin's statement that I think it's going to be hard to block existing work. But the thing that I would make sure to do is ask, what are their goals, and do you have clear success metrics? Because if you have that in place, and those are always valid questions. So if they don't have that, that's a good place to start working with the PM and the engineering lead and making sure that that's in place. Once you have that in place, you have a way of actually discussing and evaluating the UX that you're looking at. Before you have that, it's just that I say, you say conversation, right? So I think having those things in place is going to really set you up for success in having those conversations moving forward. And then you can start and say, hey, I've got this other idea where we could go and do some research, and we can now come up with like a new way of doing this. And then you can run experiments and test it and kind of take Erin's like ideas through. But it's probably a bit of a mindset of like, I'm not going to change this right now, but I can set us up for success in like a year and a half as we like move through this.
Yeah.
Thank you, guys.
And one thing I would also add to that is, you know, just, you know, you can't go back and change this at this point, but when joining a new role and joining a team is really being clear on expectations and alignment, understanding where they're at in a process, how much they want to be influenced, and how much they're willing to change or want your input in that process, or if your role is more about the future processes and jumping into projects that aren't in the midst of being created.
Yes, right. Thank you, guys. That's insightful one. Thank you.
Sure.
So shout out for staying up late to join the That's awesome.
Yeah, sadly. Yeah. Thank you, guys.
Cool. Yeah, as I said, we have some more time here, and there's still a couple of people. So if anyone wants to hop on stage, then now is the time to do so. Meanwhile, let me just scroll through the chat a little bit here and see what we have. Oh yeah, actually, so there was something that Saskia mentioned in the chat a couple of minutes ago, and it was about, or basically the way I interpreted it was about kind of A/B testing, experimentation, and also I would say formative research in general, having similar but different impediments. I think in a lot of companies. For experimentation, A/B testing is often about infrastructure. It's often about getting enough things into place that might be expensive or at least a lot of work. to get going. Whereas I feel like with the formative research, it's often more about willingness of people to participate in it, or time, not just willingness, time of people to participate in the process, so that it can have all this this impact. So I'm wondering if the two disciplines, if there's maybe some things that they can learn from each other, like in overcoming these, similar but different obstacles that they face.
Yeah, I think you got us, Philip.
I think the only thing that what I really liked about your presentation, Erin, the one thing that I struggle with in this is for sure the resourcing, and I did like the make sure you have a dedicated resource, and it makes a lot more sense for A/B testing than I think it does for ethnography, where I think it needs to be a bit more spread out. But it's similar in the sense that maybe make sure that in your roadmap there is time for your UXR people to go and spend time on longer term things, right? And carve that out. And when you go through your prioritization, have a sticky that says we need long-term research, we need to define it, right? And I just that it's hard without the dedicated resource.
Yeah. And I think I don't know if that came out while you were doing your 7 minutes, or if it was another question that you were answering, Rina, but it also made me think about how we can use our user research teams in a better way, since we have our product strategy now. So Freeletics hasn't had a product strategy over the past years, and they've kind of been working towards company objectives that are in place for a year period. But then once it gets towards the end of that, they don't necessarily know what's coming next, and they don't know, who are they trying to be in the long term, who should be the competitors, et cetera. So now that we've defined that and put some things on a strategic roadmap in that way, we can take time to say, hey, we have a topic that's coming up in 4 months or 8 months, and now we can start validating it a little bit more, because we also made a decision as we did the product strategy. We made a decision to do it in 3 months, and so we did the end-to-end process in 3 months, which is rather short, and we probably could have spent a good 6 months doing that to make sure it was more picture perfect. But we do recognize that things change, and therefore these things still need to be validated further. And I think that's where we can really take our teams and researchers to investigate as we move forward.
Yeah, I agree 100% to that.
Yeah, we can work together on that.
Yeah. Cool. So I don't see a lot of other questions or requests. So I don't know, maybe as a last thing, Erin, is there something that you would like to ask Rina, and vice versa?
I can start, but I think you won't be able to answer my question right now. But at what point do you think that products are ready to start A/B testing? What's the level of users that need to be there before we get reasonable results?
In terms of a number, I think you need to have at least several hundred people a day, repetitively. Probably, I would say, I don't know, off the top of my head. The thing is, I worked with a luxury condition at Delivery Hero where we did have many users to play around with, so we weren't so stretched for traffic. But I would say maybe, if you have in the thousands of users a day, that would be a really great place to start. However, that also depends on, are these users going to, are they all hitting this part of the funnel or wherever you want to be testing? So no matter how many users you have, less people might be seeing the feature that you're actually testing. So that's a condition. Yeah. And in that case, I would say if you do have very little traffic, then, the best ways that you can go about getting learnings are having user research and surveys, heat maps could be really valuable to learn, how we're using users' behavior. And also, if you do want to experiment with something, then testing really high impact changes. So, it's not the stage for maybe testing a small change of color or something that might not have too much impact. But if you want to test something big, it could be something where you get learnings, even though you don't have so much traffic.
That's great. Thank you, Erin.
And I think I'm good. No questions from my side, but I very much enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you. Thank you.
Cool. Then thank you both so much. We are actually exactly at time. It's almost as if we planned this. Cool. Thank you so much for participating. Thank you, everyone who's still here, for hanging around and listening, and for also discussing. So yeah, we can all pop over to Indy and Daniel now, and then I'll see you all later.
Thanks, Philip.
Thank you.
Bye.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Bye.